Hello, everybody. I hope you can see and hear me. I've just been fiddling with all of my settings like mad in the background in an attempt to hopefully sort out some live streaming for later. For those of you who know my blogs already and various streamy bits already, you'll know that I've been doing maps. Oh, let me just mute myself there. I could just hear my own voice. That didn't work. I've been live streaming maps on the Warhammer world for a while, and that paused while I was doing the start for the Lawhammer actual play for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I'm intending to restart that again, and I've had to change a bunch of settings in the background. So to test all of this and to check if it's all working, I got pinged by somebody over in Discord about the announcement that Games Workshop made yesterday. I say announcement, it was just a blog post that Games Workshop made yesterday about the old world Warhammer, the old world, whatever, and how they've mentioned some of the rules and what they're intending to do. And they asked what I thought of it. Now, I've not read it, so I thought I'd read it live and see how that actually turns out. So I'm going to quickly ping that one over there. And if everything works, I should be able to bring up that blog like so. Let's find out if it works. Add to stream. Let's see if that pings up in a moment. Right, so I'm just going to read through the blog and give some of my opinions on exactly what it says as we go. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Addy Law. I used to produce and indeed wrote the current edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay with my pals and my friends and all the cool folks that were down with that. And I've been writing for Warhammer for quite a large chunk of my life and playing with it since the very beginning. I have played every single edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles under its various guises. I have played every edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as well. So to say that I've been doing this for a while is a bit of an understatement. Many of the maps that you might see online that didn't come from the studio came up from me in the past. So let's have a quick check at what this blog says and work our way through it. Right, so Old World Developer Diary, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm assuming that that's going to be a good start for many of you out there who want the Old World Warhammer game to be similar to what came beforehand, because as we all know, many of us absolutely adored not just the world, but the game that was built around it by Games Workshop. Let's see what we've got. So the Old World team are back again. Excellent. Yeah, let's blah, 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 pass that back. We embarked upon a daunting task of redesigning Warhammer the Old World. We want to create a modern game in the mold of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I'm going to go check what the star is right at the bottom. Let's have a quick check there. The early name, I'll just tell you about the names for Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Yeah, it had different names. It was almost a roleplay game right at the very beginning. And for those of you that's seen the first or the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, you'll immediately know that see its roleplay roots. And to a degree, in the third edition of the game as well, you can see it as well. So let's carry on. A reimagining of the classic tabletop war game that would appeal to both veterans of the old world and newcomers to this most venerable of fantasy realms. Excellent. Let me just double check there. Good. With this in mind, we set about playing lots of games. Well, somebody has to do it. I think that I'm actually interested. What's the stars at the bottom? The 2-star, second one. It's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it. Yeah, well, somebody's got to do it. This makes me happy. I'm glad that they immediately started by thinking we're going to play lots of games of Warhammer. One of the things that we did when we were designing the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, for example, was to look at all of the editions that came previously and play lots of games. Now, I obviously played every game to death, so I knew it really well, but nevertheless, it's a really good place to begin. So let's see what they say next. Some good old dwarves being dwarfy and elves being elfy. For several months, the designers regularly assembled to play games of every edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Oh, that pleases me. Reminding ourselves of the rules that in some cases we hadn't played for decades. No, that's brilliant. That beyond pleases me. One of the arguable issues of Warhammer Fantasy Battle was that through its editions, it became very iterative, in that each one built upon pretty much just the previous edition and trying to fix all of the errors or make it more exciting or make it more accessible or make it make more money or whatever was required of that particular edition. And what came before that was often relegated. Really nice to see that they went through all of the editions. I have enormously fond memories of playing the 3rd edition in particular and the 4th edition, both of which were pretty much dominant in my life. I was working for Games Workshop through the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th, I think. Maybe not the 7th, maybe the 6th. I'd have to check. I was in Games Workshop, resigned, in Games Workshop again, resigned. So somewhere around there anyway. So I have played every edition to death. And it's really good to see that they're doing the same things, because each one brought something different to the table. And I'm really pleased to see that they're doing that. I know that that's the smallest of sentences from their blog, but for someone who is very keen at seeing Warhammer not relegate all the things from the past to the past, and as someone who has often, whenever I've been doing design work on Warhammer, to try and merge it all together into one big aesthetic whole, that is, I don't care what the rest of the blog says. I'm now happy. Great job, designers. Before I go and read the rest, I'm going to check if there's any comments there. Oh, some people are there. Hey, made it. Great to see that you're there, Rapture. Jinx says, I presume I'm pronouncing your name right. The man of the myth. Oh, yeah, that's very nice. Thank you very much for saying so. Neil says, I recommend watching the videos by Jordan Sorcery and the history of the various editions of War Fantasy Battle. Excellent channel. Rick Priestley is a fan. Good to hear that. I have never watched them because I have almost no free time at all. Magnus says, here for a like in the algorithm. The Warhammer I destroyed by the Horror. Let's not go on to the whole end times or I'll start a rant. Next, we have, I wonder if movement will be simplified since 8th edition rules were very convoluted. Ha ha ha. Then you'll find most of the editions weren't that much different. There was lots of tiny tweaks about how units wheeled and shifted around, but they were never that much different. There was lots of, turn 90 degrees, and they didn't really work very well with the movement templates sometimes. They didn't really think it through in terms of the practicalities of it being on the table. And I did sometimes wonder exactly how much playtesting went into some of their choices, where they should have just built it around the movement templates, because that would have been so much faster in practice, but that's by the by. Anyway, so let's carry on. We wanted to identify which parts of a classic game we enjoyed the most. Good. Which parts we felt could be improved upon? Great. Here are some of the tweaks we've made to the rules. Oh, how exciting. So first, drawing the battle lines. Warhammer the World's a game based on mass combat. We know this. Large armies, blah, blah, regimental units, inherent, yada, yada. I'll read it just because I said I would. The rules encourage players to field units of varying size based on their type and role. Perhaps most importantly, the formation units adopt. How wide or deep they are just as significant as where they were deployed and how quickly they advance. Interesting. I wouldn't say that all of the previous editions of the game did indeed do that. Formations that they adopted were often much less important than the characters that you put in the front line. And the depths of the units in previous editions were really often only useful for rank bonus. And if you were using a very expensive unit, that rank bonus could sometimes be exceedingly expensive in points, where if you're using something like, say, Skaven Slaves, it costs next to nothing, or Goblins or whatever. But depending on the edition, Hero Hammer editions, particularly in the mid-era from 4th up to maybe 6th-ish or whatever, that was particularly the case, although units did come back to the fore to a degree, particularly when they started making their big mass blocks. Before I run off past that one, I shall quickly check me comments. We have only played first and second, hated the power creep. Then I started the Dwarves were powerful, then Black Hort Skaven. So first and second Warhammer, are you sure that you're meaning first and second Warhammer Fantasy Battle? Because the very first, like, say, white box sets and similar. I haven't got my copy around. It's in storage at the moment. But the most common edition that most people generally think of as the first edition Warhammer is 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle. That's the one with the elves and dwarves. You had inside it a cardboard cutout of Eltharion the Grim facing off against Grom the Podge. So the Grim Warder Tory of Rest facing off against goblins that had somehow, and it was never really properly explained, arrived in Ulthuan through all the shifting mist. They made some attempts to explain it, but they never really got there in any realistic fashion when they made Ulthuan so much more big in later editions. Yet Grom still pushed his way through that because Grom was the Podge. But yeah, we'd be interested to know if it was definitely the first or the second that you played there. And then ads, what do you think of Life Master, both tabletop and RPG? I'll cover that after if you want me to do so. Remind me at the end of the stream. I have played both, loved both for a variety of reasons. Then R says, can you do Life Master for 4th Ed? Yeah, that's 4th Ed Warhammer Fantasy Role Play. I imagine that's what you meant when you were talking about the Fantasy Role Play earlier, perhaps for Grualdfar. Anyway, Life Master for 4th Ed, yes, you absolutely can do, and it works really nicely. Good old Battles for La Maison Tal can be redone. The Boat Person says, good evening, Slog, good evening. Good to catch stream live, and it's also good to be live. I've not been live for what feels like months, other than doing the Warhammer stuff for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, largely because, well, I was ill, really ill, and still am recovering. I have a pile of pills. It's a small mountain over in the corner over there to try and make me feel much better. But today is the first day I actually spent working end to end. So super exciting to be doing that. It's nice to get a little bit of time off at the end. I hope they keep the canon rules because they were fun. I did like the canon rules, but I imagine they might change them because canon rules went through a variety of controversies over the course of time. Magnus then has added, hi, Farming the 38th. Love my elves, as did I. Thought at the time I wasn't the best, though at the time, pardon me, I wasn't the best painter. It doesn't really matter. Once you've got them all masked up on the table, basic army paint jobs just look stunning regardless. It only really matters if you're picking them up and looking at them individually. When they're all laid out there, they look absolutely gorgeous. For me, back in 3rd edition and into 4th, I had every, Lindsay sitting over there trying to bemuse me at the side. I had every army back in 4th edition because I used to run my own shop, which meant I could give myself an enormous discount. So I had every single army that Warhammer 4th edition offered. My largest was Nurgle at some 30,000 points, as I recall, all painted, which for me was ridiculously rare. And the fact it was Nurgle was also ridiculously rare because I don't even really like Nurgle that much. But it was a really good army. Anyway, moving on. From the early 80s. Yeah, that would be just about right. Perfect for that one. And 4th was High Elves and Goblins. It certainly was on the starter box. Good old Grom the Punch. Because Grom was the best. Yeah, totally. Enter 64. Hello, Andy. Any advice for starting legendary cards for? Yes, I do. Bring me up on another stream in that one. This one's going to be mostly about Warhammer Old World. I'm going to get back into the reading because I want to get through this. It's not a very long blog, but I do want to see what else it has to say. Right. Right. The rules encourage units with wide frontages, but the ideal, so that's the new rules, I presume, but the ideal number of models per rank is decided by the player, not enforced by the rules. Okay. To do this, we've ensured that as many models as possible can fight in combat, giving even those models that are within the fighting rank, but not in base contact with the enemy, the opportunity to bring their weapons to bear. Okay, so that actually sounds like, broadly speaking, a good idea. One of the biggest problems with Warhammer was the amount of slowdown you got as units got closer together and then got ready to charge. And wheeling and getting that perfect charge in was essential, ensuring that you got as much as your front rank to bear on their front rank and also as little of their front rank as possible to bear as you could. And that meant that certain units that had been set up to effectively, say, bog down cavalry, for example, nice big deep units of infantry with some sort of spear or equivalent, a well-positioned cavalry unit could just clip it at the edge and defeat it purely by the nature of the way that the rules worked. And it sort of sucked. Where in this case, it sounds like they're going to say, just they're blocks of units, and that whole block is going to be fighting. So many ranks will get a go. The front rank will all get a go, regardless of whether they're base to base. And that sounds potentially great from the perspective of making the game fast, because there is nothing worse than sitting down there and two players looking at each other going, that one's not in base to base. Yes, it is. That one's in base to base. No, that's beyond the diagonal card. No, my champion is going to get his attacks in. No, he's not. And that's why Games Workshop often had nice little rules in their tournaments for being good sportsmen, largely because their rules themselves promoted not being a good sportsman. The rules themselves were finicky and tight and open to an awful lot of interpretation on the actual battlefield as to exactly what was fighting what. And that was, frankly, a pain in the neck when you were playing the game against somebody who wasn't a good sportsman. And it made Warhammer a not fun and often slow game, where in this case, it sounds like it might not be the case, but it sounds like you'll just move your block in and that block gets to wave around some sticks and beat living crap out the other side, which means you'll be able to roll your bucket of dice far more quickly. You'll be aware of what your own troops can do instantly because you'll have already decided what's on those ranks and exactly how many dice they roll. You'll know it already. You'll just be able to pick up the dice and roll. You won't need to sit there and carefully count which ones are in a position to attack. And say you were playing high elves, you had a second rank that could attack, which ones definitely could attack and which ones didn't count as being base to base. You just roll the lot. That sounds good, particularly from the perspective of keeping the game fast. It's going to be more about moving the blocks around and getting the best utility out of those blocks than it is about the very, very precise base-to-base contacts. I could end up being very wrong for the final game, though. Combined with the freedom to create and arm characters as you choose from a wide range of options, players have a lot of strategic choices to make when building their units and writing their muster lists. Choices that will, in turn, inform their tactics on the battlefield. Interesting you should say that. That was, I would argue, a core part of the fourth edition to maybe the sixth in particular, the good old Hero Hammer editions, there was an awful lot of choices. You would sit there as a player going through all of the magic items one by one, trying to create the perfect combination to build your best characters. And that was eroded with all of the previous editions, largely because it slowed things down for creating, but a lot of people really loved it. People love choice, and choice never really impacts the speed of play at the table. It's always something that impacts the speed of play outside the table, which means it's really good for building up an obsession. You're sitting there for like 5-10 hours building your perfectly finely honed 3,000 point army, of which, of course, 1,500 points was purely characters, bedecked with magic items that you had very carefully chosen to be the best ones possible. Interesting that they're sort of returning to that, at least by suggestion. The later editions of Warhammer massively limited the number of items that you had access to, and in some respects massively limited the different tactics that came to play. Slowly but surely over the course of the editions, each of the army lists became more homogenized. That's not quite right. The armies of a particular army list became more homogenized. If you went up against Dark Elves, you kind of knew exactly what you were going to get because they didn't actually have a lot of choices. They only had their core units, whatever war machines that you drop on top, whatever cards you drop on top, and a select number of spells and a very select number of magical items that they had available. And that was the same for most of the armies. So you tended to be able to judge what you were going to get before you got going. And it actually made the armies a bit, well, boring. I mean, I played 8th edition to death, end to end, played it again and again and again. And you tended to find that no matter how many players you went against, there were certain, let's say, better builds. And because of those better builds, you always expected certain things to hit the battlefield. And that was kind of hashtag not fun. Let's just double check. Any other comments? Lindsay says lead weight. Those were the days. Let's just not get into good old lead weight back when I was staff. We have another comment. You got a favorite edition that you would love them to really base everything on? That's a hard question. I'll get to that at the very end. Lawhammer, do you think Warhammer Total War is going to have effect in the game? Absolutely, 100%. I'll get onto that if you've got any question at the end about that one, because I think it definitely will. Total War Warhammer is a freaking astonishingly popular game, and it's also an astonishingly good game. It's something that really kept Warhammer in terms of the old world alive. And it's a game that I don't think will just be influential upon what the studio does with its new one. It will be behind many of the decisions that they're looking at as they make their game design and lock it down in place, because they're going to want everybody that's playing the Total War game to move over to Warhammer the Old World and buy that, which means that they're going to need an awful lot of bridges between those two games nicely built in terms of whether that's rules or whether the presentations of the armies match. So, for example, Grand Cathay and exactly how that expresses, it's going to be very, very close to how it has been expressed, I imagine, in Warhammer Total War, Warhammer, whichever way around. I'll be interested to see what they do with Kislev, though, because one of the central thrusts of the Kislev army in the Total War side is something that's very grounded in the now with its religious schisms. And the older version of Kislev won't have that, but I imagine they might date it back just to make the two armies immediately accessible, perhaps. David Jones has just dropped in a comment and says, random question. Do you think we could see a minor faction such as Albion playing a bigger part? Mercenaries, Warmaster? See, I've got a lot to say in Warmaster. I love that game. And do I see it potentially? We've seen how both 40k and Age of Sigmar have released a variety of almost small releases. And that could be done with Warhammer if its popularity ensues. But the big thing that's arguably different about Warhammer is it has always been about those big chunky armies. That's been difficult sometimes for Games Workshop to fund because these armies are often huge with lots of varieties, which means loads of different models, loads of different codes. And for the tournament play, an awful lot of fixed stuff. We'll be interested to see how they change that up for when they do this particular version, whether they start in one area and just do those and then move on and then just dump them and onto the next sets of armies, or whether they do something else. I haven't been paying that much attention to what their plans are. I might have to go up and look at the old blogs. So we'll find out. Magnus says, gotta go. Just want to come and say hi. It's all good to see you, Magnus. Again, I like and such. Have a good stream and a very good evening. Yeah, thanks. So let's get back to our good old blog here because it's not long, but I've somehow managed to already drag it out for about 15 minutes or so. So, breaking the enemy. One thing we were keen for Warhammer the World to represent was the push and pull of battle. Interesting, feels a bit more War Master immediately, maybe a little bit more Warhammer 3rd edition. Capturing the way in which hard-pressed army will gradually succumb to fatigue and attrition. I like it. Perhaps finicky. We'll see how it works in practice. To achieve this, units that lose a round of combat will often give ground reluctantly. So rather than just breaking out immediately and then just running off and being killed, they'll perhaps move back a bit. Others can move forward, move in. That can be fun. As they say, giving ground rather than immediately breaking and fleeing, as they say, while the winner can advance to press their advantage. So that'll be interesting. If the rules are going to be built around that push and shove, that means you could actually work towards trying to push or indeed have weaker units get you pushed back but not broken and then work into flank attacks. There could actually be some interesting tactics that will work around from building that. One of the biggest issues with particularly the hero hammer styles of Warhammer was there was very little in the way of actual proper tactics. It was much more about getting as many kills in with your characters as possible. Even when they changed the process of hero hammer down into the 8th editions of 6, 7, and 8, it still came into the big thing, getting as many casualties as possible, getting the break, making the armies flee, and that's a thing. So yeah, let's see what else that they've got to say in that one. Players will quickly learn, however, that a cunning enemy will use this push and pull of battling units to lay traps, and an advancing unit runs the risk of exposing vulnerable flanks to well-timed counter charges. I like that a lot. I'll also say I quite like the idea that they're perhaps bringing in some War Master elements, because War Master was a brilliant game. I was working for Games Workshop when War Master came out first time round, and I took all my staff out to see Joan of Arc, the one with Mila Jovovich in it, if you remember that movie. We had an absolutely marvelous time, went back, played loads of War Master and adored it. But I always had, for all I loved War Master, a couple of really big beefs with it. I'll go further in saying concerns, just things that bugged me. War Master was all about a giant swooping scale, huge Warhammer battles, but the actual armies themselves never really did that. They just reproduced the Warhammer armies, and the really big, chunky, awesome things that they could have put in were relegated to being relatively useless characters that just allowed units to march around. It was a game very much about units, and it was to a degree a game very much about a war game. A classic war game almost. It was a brilliant game, but didn't really utilize the grand scale that Warhammer offered. We should have had some crazy, massive bullshit for most of the armies that we could have dropped down. Some enormous giants that just laid waste to entire units by themselves. Huge dragons, massive shagoths, or whatever. They should have been a part and parcel of that, with units being able to push them back and do things to them. But that wasn't the case. But I think this is the correct scale to have that War Master, let's say, effect play in quite nicely, because Warhammer has always been smaller, I would argue, than the greater scale that Warhammer has to offer. We see pictures of giant greater demons that loom over troops that are like tiny little stick men, but then you get them in Warhammer and you find out that no, actually they're only like 3 times the size because of the realities of the scale that Warhammer presents. And War Master didn't use that scale, and Warhammer, or Old World in this case, will be limited by it. Super interested to see where that one goes. I quite like the idea of the push and pull. That sounds fun. Oh, my favorite subject, the power of magic. On that, this week, I'm going to be streaming with Lore Master of Sotek. I'll do a quick call out for that next Sunday at 4 o'clock UK time. And we're going to be discussing magic in the old world and exactly how that expresses why it is the way it is, and taking a deep dive into the winds, how they manifest, what they are. I've written a lot about this in the past, obviously for Warhammer Fantasy roleplay side, but you tend to find on the role-playing side of the greater Warhammer world that a lot more detail is required to ensure that your characters can understand it all. So I have written a lot on the subject and really looking forward to deep diving into that next Sunday. If you want to know more about that, go check Lore Master Sotek's channels. He will inevitably be advertising about that relatively soon for Twitch, YouTube, and where the hell else we're going to be. I'm going to take a quick look over at the comments before I run off. Tom, it's alive. It totally is alive. I live. Law raids. Oh, I'm the law. Hello. Thanks for the raid. You rock. We've got loads of raidy bits. Love raid. Do love a raid as well. All the raids. Let's move down to Roderick saying, Lordy, I'm going to be hearing Andy in my sleep after listening to all Uber's recommendations in this. I do like to be in everybody's heads. If you don't know out there, I have been live streaming every Friday with the bestest people in the world and actual play of the Enemy Within for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Let's say 4th edition, although we've adapted a lot of the rules. And we now have 24 of those episodes up, and it has been an absolute joy to put together. Barfoot says, how do Fishbang procreate? Laura, he totally does. We've discussed this in the past. Yeti says, I want 1 meter scale armies. That'd be one hell of an army. And Aaron then adds, Warmaster, love the rules. Me too. Went cross-eyed painting the minis. Me too. Also, Roderick then adds, let's see if we catch this later. I've got 20 minutes of those House of Joy to watch. Yeah, go enjoy the House of Joy. There's some good bits at the end there. Andy didn't even notice the raid. I didn't. I apologize, but I've noticed it now, which is nice. Thank you so much for the raid. Yeah, he is about to notice. And yes, he has indeed noticed. I got there. Hey, Lord Master, you're here. I was just talking about you 2 seconds ago. If you didn't notice, I was discussing what we're going to be discussing next Sunday. But I wasn't saying anything too heavy. I'll leave that for you to have a chat about. The lore beers have arrived. I did notice one way or another. Right, before I do that, let's go and check out the little bits it says about magic, because I'm interested to see what they're going to say on that one. So, the power of magic. Magic's integral to the game, always has been, though the mechanics of its use are simple. Interesting. The untutored wizards of the old world practice strange lores of magic of their own devising. Oh, that's good to hear. Manipulating the winds of magic and crafting spells that suit their purpose. Now, this is super fascinating. It was one of the things I was a bit worried about when they announced the old world, but only a little bit worried about. The Warhammer world as we know it, and we've lived with it for pretty much since 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle, has been set in a period where the colleges of magic for the Empire existed. And the colleges of magic are fundamental to pretty much every single edition of Warhammer that's been created, because it's the core starting point that they used for building the rules, and then they added all the satellite rules around that. So you would find that the color magic, for example, that got added in Warhammer 4th edition in the battle magic set, was pretty much grounded in what the magic of the Empire used, and then everybody else sort of got bits and pieces of that. But the old world setting is set before the colleges of magic exist. Now, the magic that the colleges of magic are going to come to use already exists and is already codified, but this time it's by the High Elves over in Ulthuan, and they have a far broader array of magic on top of that. But the Empire, in its current fractured state, so we're talking before the Great War against Chaos, and the Empire's fractured into thousands and hundreds of different little counties and kingdoms and duchies and all the rest of it, with different competing factions attempting to control each part of it. They do not have any real foundation in magic at all that is academic or old. Sorta. There's already several written into the setting. It'll be interesting to see if they use any. For example, the Guild of Magic up in Middenheim is long established and has a long history and has been using magic for a very, very long time. In the modern setting, that gets completely, let's say, overruled by the colleges of magic. Be interesting to see if they use that. It'll be interesting to see how they justify having any magic users at all, because the Cult of Sigmar has always been written in such a fashion that, well, witches are bad, okay, and they are to be hunted down and killed, which means that the standard Empire army would never include them. But of course they will, because everyone wants any advantage that they can get. But I'll be interested to see if they tackle that and how they tackle that. And they're suggesting already that they're going to be creating their own strange lores of magic. I love that. Every strange one that pops up, I will write for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, because I won't be able to help myself. That'll be awesome. And their own ways of manipulating the winds of magic as well really, really pleases me. I'm hoping that they go boom a lot. While some recklessness might alarm some, it gives wizards freedom to cast wide range of spells with ease. They would have had a wide range regardless. I'll be interested to see how they do magic. I'm going to continue reading on before I make any comments. To reflect this, spellcasting has been liberated, okay, spread through the different phases of the game. Oh, it's no longer a magic phase, rather than restricted to just one. In doing so, we've ensured that every spell available to a wizard can have a significant impact on the battle if cast in the right place and at the right time. Okay, I have some comments, but I'll read the rest down to before final thoughts. Situations where a single spell can decide the outcome of the battles are rare. That's good. The focus has shifted from keeping track of dice pools, and by gods, there was a lot of those, or hands of cards, which I sort of loved, into the positioning of wizards, so where they are in the battlefield. Okay, are they going to be drawing magic according to their positioning? We'll find out. This means players will have to plan ahead, moving their wizards as carefully as any other unit, both to ensure that they can bring their magic to the right place at the right time, to ensure they can counter the spells of enemy wizards. Okay, so it's going to be more about what they can do, what's within reach, and when they can do their dispels. All right, so I would argue that the positioning of wizards has always been important in Warhammer. I would also argue that they were often game-winning, to the point that, particularly in, say, 4th edition, 5th edition, you required wizards. Now, I will give you a different example for why that was an oddity. You didn't require heavy cavalry. You didn't require cannons. You didn't require certain types of characters, but you absolutely did require wizards, because if you didn't have them, when it came to the magic phase, the cards would come out. You could do pretty much fuck all with yours, and they just zapped you and things blew up and you died. So the Wizard War was as much a part of some of the editions of Warhammer as the actual war that was going down on the battlefield, and sometimes a more important part. A well-positioned set of wizards, maybe a 4th and a 1st for your different dispels, how they handled across the editions, they worked in different ways, was essential, and also out-wizarding your opponent. So having, say, for example, a 5th level wizard, when normally there was only 4ths in, say, 4th edition or 5th edition, made a huge difference. Teclis, for example, or someone with a magical artifact added +1 to their magic level so that they could more easily dispel their opponents. The old Dispel Magic Scroll being absolutely essential for those editions. And the Hero Hammer era is apparently going to be, as we mentioned earlier up on there, listened to in terms of building your characters and making something interesting, but the wizards themselves won't have as much of an effect. Be interesting to see whether they're force multipliers. To a degree, in 8th edition, they tried to do that, but it didn't always work, where they added extra utility, but weren't the be-all and end-all of the battlefield, where in previous editions, they were utterly essential, but only because your opponent would have them. If you both had them, they often did an awful lot of nothing, just sparring with each other, with the occasional spell getting off. I played that edition a hell of a lot. Oh, in fact, I played them all a hell of a lot. And wizards were always an interesting part. They, to the point that, particularly when they're using the card games, the actual card game part of it, that's in 4th and 5th edition, as I recall, that could dominate your play, in that as much time could be spent dealing with your wizards in a relatively magical game as you could find dealing with the actual movement of units and shooting at each other, sometimes more so. And that meant that certain armies became much more boring to play. And particularly, I'm looking at, say, dwarves, where when it came to the magic phase, they had a couple of things that they could throw off or whatever, but they had frick all to do in comparison to their opponents, where they were just pretty much there to dispel and stop things happening, or where their opponents got to do all the exciting stuff over on the other side. And that just made it less interesting to play them, particularly because they were already super slow to move over the battlefield. The dwarves, in terms of overall popularity, were never the most back in those editions because of that. I'll be interested to see how they keep the wizards interesting, but don't relegate things like dwarves to the point where they're no longer useful, or whether they'll just copy and paste the mechanics over and say, yes, dwarves don't have spellcasters, but he's got a rune that acts the same as the spellcaster, which completely invalidates the dwarves in many respects and what makes them unique, but at least it keeps the game balanced. It'll be super fascinating to see what they do with there. Long story short, this sounds fine. There's nothing there that particularly bugs me. I'm going to go check over the comments now because I've not really been running on those. How long am I streaming for tonight? I'm not very long. I'm actually doing a test this evening to make sure that everything was working. I have no desire to sit here for hours and hours chatting lore, although I will take questions at the end because, you know, I kind of can't help myself. John adds, I also been hearing you in my sleep because I push you, Warhammer. My voice will be everywhere. Let's move down there. Can you say, I am the law? Well, I am the law. Right, so let's have a quick pick from Master. Okay, so I'm very curious about the new magic rules. Me too. They seem the most extreme change. I agree. I'm very happy that they're taking us specifically before the College of Magic, so things will get weird. Yeah, me too. I remember writing for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. And we're talking there, that's the early noughties, so about 2006, mid noughties when I was writing this part. And I was told under no uncertain terms that we could only do the magics that were inside the studio. So we're talking the colors of magic, a couple of extra lores, and that was about it. And for the Warhammer side, that didn't make a great deal of sense because there was an awful lot of ancient human traditions that were still in the setting and hadn't been expressly removed. And I was quite keen to dive into those. And I was told to begin with, no. So I took a different angle and I said I'd like to do rules for something like, say, Ice Witches. Because Ice Witches were a part of the setting at that point. There'd been a nice little pamphlet written about the Kislev army and exactly how that could express by Gab Thorpe. A whole bunch of extra material got dropped into that. It was still current enough that it felt like it was something that the roleplay game could do without feeling like we'd be contradicting or adding to the studio. They were like, yeah, that's great. So I got to delve deep into a variety of different witch rules for the fantasy roleplay, add a little bit of extra detail. And through doing that, and Games Workshop realizing that it wasn't the end of the universe for Magic, I then got to add the Hedge Witches in Shades of Empire. And Hedge Witches were the first real dive into human magic post first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, where it was going to get a bit weird, a bit different, and also, and importantly for the Warhammer setting, not dangerous per se. It was still magic and it still had issues, but it wasn't, these are not trained wizards from the colleges of magic, so they must immediately be super dangerous, all be evil, channeling dark magic and witches. No, they were an ancient tradition that had their own rules that kept them relatively safe from the darker aspects of the winds of magic. And that was really well received. Everybody really liked that. But Games Workshop go through loops of this where they go, I think that's brilliant. And then they come round and they go, you know what? No, we're ditching all that. It's just the color magic again. Back to, we think that's brilliant. And I'm utterly delighted that they're going back to, we think that's brilliant, because it's a perfect opportunity to really mine into all the super cool details that you can get out of the Warhammer world, because we've got ourselves, just in the Empire alone, and we're not talking about the rest of the old world here, all of which will have its own unique magical traditions as well, but just in the Empire, that's 2,000, almost 300 years worth of magical development based on a people that were already dealing with magic at the beginning anyway. So we've got ourselves a huge length of time to get something really cool, some of which will be super dangerous, some of which will be super safe, some of which will be super weird. And I'm utterly excited to see what they do with it. I'm also excited to adapt parts of it for my own games, for when I'm doing, say, for example, the role-playing game, because I'll almost certainly build rules for any old nonsense they bring forward. Indeed, I think it's quite likely that the people who are currently doing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay might already have access to at least some of the ideas, if not necessarily all the rules, so that they can start planning ahead for what they're doing. At least I hope they do, because that would be awesome, because you'll get to see some official material on it too. Anyway, moving on. Time for Lord of the River Reich. How big can dragons be? Freaking huge! There's the Warhammer world. This is not Game of Thrones. They can get far bigger than those. Right, so I'm going to quickly run on to the end of the here with their final thoughts, just to see what else they say. These exciting game mechanics, they end, and many more besides, combined with the classic elements of beloved game, give players old and new, and the old one, plenty to consider when planning their armies and mastering their tactics. See, this is something that I think Warhammer has often always failed at, and Warmaster did better at, and that's building something that had solid tactics built into it. Often it just came into getting my unit that's super, super hard, and I've min-maxed like mad, into combat with their unit that's somewhat similar, but in such a fashion that they don't get to get all of their advantages. And some armies, because of that, dominated. Indeed, I will make a small comment about Games Workshop design in general, and that's that I in the past, it was often quite isolated. They weren't out there with their playtesters. They weren't out there speaking to hundreds of people. It was often just the studio working with themselves. And the people in the studio played the games in a particular way, often to make the coolest game that they possibly can, but not necessarily the best balance in terms of people coming along and power playing their way through the rules. I'll give an example of that so we can get it all in our heads. Think of Blood Bowl 3rd edition, for those of you that know it. When it came out, the game was freaking awesome, really good. It was a massive improvement, I would argue, over the second game, which often bogged down in 2 cages. However, some of the various ways that the individual rules worked together meant that certain teams massively dominated, to the point that Games Workshop changed its tune over time and started saying, yes, well, of course they do, because it's not all fair in Blood Bowl, which was not necessarily the design intent to begin with. It's just that certain teams were so much better than others, and that, no matter how much it may feel, Warhammer and Blood Bowl was bad design. And I'll say it was why it was bad design for one very obvious reason. And it was a reason I had to tackle with quite a lot when I was speaking to various peeps about Blood Bowl. And that's that certain teams were rubbish or not very good. But you don't know that if you're coming in as a new player. So you buy the team that you think super, super cool. You get that, you paint it up, you spend ages, then you lose 12 games in a row and you go, fuck Blood Bowl, worst game ever. And that was purely because the people in the studio didn't play unfairly. They didn't try to abuse the rules to get the very best outcomes. They didn't foul again and again to kill every player on the opposing side, because it was just unsportsmanly. And it was just kind of uncool. Where when you were out there in the nasty Blood Bowl leagues, oh, that happened a lot. So thus the rules had to be gently adapted. Certain mutations couldn't then stack up with certain other things because it made the rules, well, just break. And that's my concern here in general. And that's that they won't playtest it enough, because Warhammer has so many more cogs and working parts in it than a very fixed, tight game like Blood Bowl. And if you want to see an example of when it breaks entirely, take, say, Lost Patrol, when it got reissued around about, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago or something. When Lost Patrol came out, the second edition of it, I was like, yeah, I'll pick that up. It's a nice wee game. The game is actually broken. It doesn't work. You can't win if you're the Space Marines. It's impossible. I'm not, the Space Marines. You can't actually win if you use the rules as written. It's so fundamentally broken that I ended up having to write a quick set of, this is how to make the game fair, and popped it up on my old blog. And that wasn't a failure in games design. The game itself was great. It just had a couple of mistakes written into it. And that's in a super tight set of game design. This is going to be a far bigger set of rules. And we're going to have a lot of contesting voices, all having their own ideas, I presume, in the studio for how it can best be manifested. And I'm super excited to see what they're going to be, whilst also being relatively convinced that the first edition of whatever comes, which of course I will be buying because I'm an idiot, the first edition when it comes will almost certainly have a bunch of rule loopholes riddled through it. And it's going to be interesting to see how they cope with that, whether they just slap patches on top with new books and new general guides that allow you to move through that, or whether they ignore it and just keep on pressing on, or whether they do a second edition relatively swiftly. That's something for us to all see. Right, so I shall now kick over and see if we have any comments to go down with. So let's start here. Mark says, I wonder if Andy's ever played one-page rules regiments and what his thoughts. I haven't played one-page rules regiments. If you've got a link for that, do drop it into my Discord. I believe I might even have a Discord link on the YouTube side, which is where you are sitting in the comments. So if you want to drop it in there, that'd be great. Hello, I'm from Sotek. Hello, great to see you here. More Master then adds, I just hope that we don't have to deal with the bullshit spells like Purple. Oh, Purple Sun Serious. I love that spell. Do you dare attack my good old Amethyst Wizards. Having said that, though, it was a bullshit spell. It was only good if it was on your side. Can magic evolve? That, I think, is something for Sotek and us to discuss this Sunday. I think that will make for an interesting one. Hello, hi there, great to see you here. Yeti then adds, the only good dwarf is a Chaos Dwarf. I find it hard to disagree. My dwarf army was actually my dwarf army is about 15,000 points for, say, 4th edition, and never was there an army, at least in that edition, that was more heavily reliant upon the rules that were built to try and support the fact that they had no magic by giving them a different sort of magic. And I didn't enjoy playing them. All the cannons were fun. Covering them over with runes was fun, but nevertheless, wasn't necessarily the most fun army to play. From your podcast, it's great. You get new fire. Yay! Delighted to see you're here. And if you do want to see Warhammer in a different fashion, do watch our fantasy roleplay streams. The very first one is in one of our playlists. Hi from Lord Master. Let's pop down here. Lord Master then adds, just checking out the new rules. Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. We've now gone through all that. There was very little in there. My overall comment will be, I am massively intrigued. Not really worried in the slightest, because I have my eyes wide open with this. I don't expect this to be God's gift to Warhammer, which many people out there are almost hinging their lives upon. What I would instead say is that I'm expecting this to be a different take on the Warhammer world. And as someone who has been playing Warhammer for, well, almost as long as I can remember, in every edition of the game, for me, that's super exciting. I expect it to contradict many parts of the established lore, because there's so much lore out there that it's really easy to miss little bits and then just create your own stuff. But not only that, it's because they themselves will want to mark out their own territory. And if there's an obscure name in one book somewhere or another, they can happily ignore that and just make their own characters that fit the stories that they want to tell. So yeah, super good time. The boat person adding, given the time period, yes. Do you think that they might add something, the Empire Beyond More Time, such as Whistler? So I will add here, The Sisters of Sigmar are not only a Mordheim thing, and this was something that was argued heavily back in the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay era, because there was a period at that point when they said there was no female Sigmarites at all. Then Mordheim came along and said, not only are there these sisters, but there's probably other orders elsewhere as well. And then when we wrote the Tome of Salvation, I wrote the Tome of Salvation, that's the religious book for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. We made it quite clear that there were women freaking everywhere across the cult in a variety of different ways. So they have a very open door there to include that. Now, witch hunters were already included in, say, the 8th edition of Warhammer. You had witch hunter characters, of which I've got 3 or 4 points painted over there. And Sisters of Sigmar, you could argue are in there with warrior priests. I'll be interested to see if they go with gendered language, which is something that Warhammer has often done in the past. So they will say high priest rather than say high cleric, even though they might represent it with a female miniature. And that just causes some issues, particularly because you don't need to use gendered language, and it really does upset some people, and there's no need to upset it. Having said that, really upsets some other people that you wouldn't use gendered language. The world's a complicated place. Our Emperor Dragons, ancient dragons of great worm size. My Emperor Dragons are huge. Wizard, Sorcerer, yeah, good. Right, let's say, Lord Master says, can't wait to build my unit of, that's a lot of Temple Guard, with Slam Mage Priest, Death Star in the old one. yeah. If we ever get a chance to meet face to face, I will annihilate said Slam Mage Priest with, I'll probably have an Empire army. I can't help myself. That's almost always my first port of call, because I do love the Empire, but I might go High Elves this time for my first one. I can't remember what armies they said would come out first. If anyone knows, do drop it in the comments. Can you have old ancient purple dragon that's not big, huge, but is instead super fast? Yes, of course you can. Dragons come in a variety of different shapes, sizes, and forms, as I think has been reiterated several times in different versions of the Warhammer world, particularly because most of the imagery that we're used to is based upon the battle game, where dragons are actually relatively small. So they're not that big. But every once in a while, they mention a story where a dragon is so big that it could probably wipe out cities by itself. So we also have maybe Tomb Kings can actually win battles. That would be nice. It's another army I didn't have a great deal of fun playing, nor did I enjoy playing the undead vampire counts that much either, largely because so much hinged upon your leaders. And they tried to break that down with later editions. But it did turn into my vampire is so freaking hard, it kills everything, unless it dies, and then I've lost. So it turned into the ultimate expression of Hero Hammer. Although that wasn't necessarily the case with the Tomb King army, it still did sort of sit in there. Moving down, Lomas says, Andy, what do you think about them seeming to say that breaking, fleeing from combat isn't going to feature anymore? They word it more as a slight shift into more disadvantaged positions and then losing combat instead of mass rounds. Not sure how I feel about that. Yes, so for those of you who don't know your Warhammer, very loosely speaking, your unit would charge another unit, or they charge you. You'd have a scrap. Whoever charged went first, unless they have big, massive weapons or special rules applied. And whoever took most casualties generally ran away. Pretty much. They did a leadership test, but that leadership test was modified by how many casualties that they took in excess of their opponent. And often, if it was high impact units doing the charge, they'd wipe out the front rank, so no one fought back against them. And it just turned into a charge mince. They ran away, they break, run, and then all the units beside them do leadership tests to see if they break as well. And that panic can spread across the army. That works really well if you've got yourself lots of units in terms of a rule design, because it doesn't really matter if you lose yourself a couple of 100-point units. It doesn't work at all well if your units are all stacked with characters, which in Warhammer they always were, and you find these characters which cost 200, 300, 400 points just hiking off the battlefield, meaning that you lose down to pure luck. So it was always an issue. So what do I like the idea that if you lose a bit, you go back a bit and they can come tumbling in? Yes, I do. I think that is a better and arguably more realistic way of looking at the way they match together, and there'd be that push and that pull, not necessarily a lot of casualties when all the shields are up and that pressure builds. Someone gets the advantage, starts pushing against the other one, drives them back. Perhaps there'll be an extreme where they've definitely won and they cause the other one to flee and panic spreads. I imagine there'll be an element of that still in, but that push and pull, I think, works really well. Plus, you can also use that to start manipulating the battlefield. One of the issues with Warhammer was it was very, very difficult to control the battlefield and where units were. You could stake out a position in a place, but you couldn't push people out of those positions. And this is a suggestion you'll be able to start maneuvering other units as well to put them into a place where you could more easily charge them with flankers or perhaps with some form of scouts that are coming in from the rear. That, to me, sounds freaking awesome, depending upon the implementation of how they do that. Really quite looking forward to that one. Apparently, someone remembers rants about Purple Sun. If I'm going to rant about one, it will almost certainly be that bloody plague spell from the bloody Skaven army, largely because I once wiped out some of the region of about 150 models with it in a single casting. Bloody marvelous. Wasn't even thankful. Good times. Nasty, 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 nasty spell. Cost 3 power to cast back in the 4th edition of the game. But because it just kept on going to another one as long as you got a kill, if you were lucky, you could just keep going forever. And when I was a kid, I used to run my own games club with a good 100 members. And we often had massive battles. We're talking 200,000 point battles. And when you're having battles of that scale with multiple armies coming on, that also means that you have yourself some truly stupendously nasty characters. And you began to see exactly how broken the rules were when you got to see some of the spellcasters doing their work. It was nasty. What's my favorite Wind of Magic? That's a little bit like saying what's my favorite baby. I've written about all of them so many times in a variety of different ways. I don't really have a favorite. I've got some favorites with the colleges because I've written a lot of material neat to the colleges, and more importantly for my own game, I've gone into much more depth with each of the colleges than has ever been presented in the official material. So the colleges of Magic to me are quite personal and I really enjoy them, but favorites really, really tough. I feel like I'm compelled to try. Bright Burn. I do like the Light Wind because I have nice stories for exactly what that all means. So I'm going to say light for this time. Next time you ask me, I'll say a different answer. Why would a wood elf devoted to core not work? Now, I see no reason why that wouldn't work. One of the things we did in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay starter set was show a bunch of wood elf Nurgle cultists, which at the time made everyone go, "You what now? How awesome!" Because nobody had really thought of that as a natural compliment. And we showed how that could work. So that was an awful lot of fun. Does the Empire still have gunpowder at the current time in the old world? Yes, it does. The Empire, depending upon which version of the background you use, the Empire's had gunpowder for more time than I can care to actually imagine. When the Lustria book came out, let's go over to Lustria and kick it in. That was all the way back in the 1400s. They had gunpowder then. That was contradicted in some other sources, and it contradicted some other sources. Cut a long story short, is there gunpowder out there? Yes. What form does that take? It'll be down to the designers of the day, but they have a wealth of options to ensure that it does. I'll be interested to see how much they go down let's say, the more steampunk angle that the Empire took on its later versions, even though there was early mechanical steeds and such like in earlier editions. It didn't really drive that home until some of the later editions of Warhammer. And whether they stick on that or decide that that is a later development and we're dealing with something that's technologically a little bit inferior to what comes later, particularly because they don't have the colleges of magic to help build things like big mechanical steeds for the Gold College. I'll be kind of fascinated to see if they do that. Personally, I would very much hope that they didn't go down that route. The challenge is on. Bretonia and they're the first two, and I have no deep interest in either. For all, I will almost certainly buy the box set, and the models will be gorgeous. But the Tomb Kings were never an army that I was very excited by. Bretonia, I've played Bretonia loads of times. I liked it when they shifted it from one version to the new version. They added the lance formation. They changed the background entirely. A lot of it was some bad puns and some interesting. 75% characters back then. Holy crap, were they powerful! But still, good army. I thought I read the change stages with a charge and a break instead of a replacement. Yeah, I think it might be that too, but we'll see. At the moment, I imagine, for all that they've almost certainly got a bunch of rules pinned down, which is why they're now beginning to discuss it out loud. If through the process of their final tests or whatever it is they're building, they realize that certain parts don't work, it could still change significantly. I suspect routing will still be a thing. So do I. It just happened to be more fun. Yeah, I agree. Yeti then adds, just like how lethal some of the newer games are, where you just get to be wiped out and charged. Yeah, it was awful. There's no push and pull multiple rounds of combat. Yeah, it wasn't good. Often it was who charged one. It's actually somewhat of a flaw with Warhammer's core design in that it's a turn by turn by turn by turn thing, which means whoever gets first turn, if they're an army that can cover that distance, they get such an advantage that you can almost win and determine who's won on the first turn, which is why in games like 40k, terrain became so massively important, because without it, everyone would just shoot each other. First person did all the firing shots, dead. Later editions obviously changed that to a degree. I'll be super interested to see how they break that up. I, ages ago, used to work for a company called Target Games. This was after my second stint with Games Workshop. And they had a game called Warzone, which some of you may or may not be aware. And it was the second edition, I think, of that game. And it had a unit activation rule. So you'd activate a unit, then your opponent would activate a unit, then you'd activate a unit, your opponent would activate a unit. The game, much more like, say, War Master, in terms of how it actually played out, although War Master still turned about, was really good in practice. It played out really smoothly. And it made me really rather annoyed when I went back to playing Games Workshop games. So this is my second time around, and finding some deep fundamental flaws, and also being able to build up armies that could take advantage of that. You play particular armies, you could find that you were almost unassailable. Wood Elves for a while really dominated around about the 6th edition if you knew what you were doing, because nobody could charge you and you could charge everyone else. And if you got first turn with those ridiculous Wood Elf arrows, you pretty much won. Anyway, moving on. And just lurking. Good. Gloomhaven Online. Nice to hear. How are things here? Pretty well. I'm enjoying being back onto the whole streaming side of things. And it's also interesting being on both YouTube and the old Twitch for a change. I haven't done that for a while. If I'd be able to learn anyone who... So I'd want to learn a Wind of Magic that didn't screw me. And most of them screw you if you're a human. Bright Magic, yeah, burn out and die. Jade Magic would probably be the easiest, although, you know, yeah. Light Magic, holy shit, no, that I can't sing. Screw that. Amber Magic, no, never. Gur can go fuck itself. Yeah, I'm not turning into a wild beastie creature. Amethyst, nope. I have no interest in that in the slightest. Yeah, if I look at them all, Jade is most certainly the one that would have least impact on my overall character and turn me into someone I wasn't, although it still absolutely would, because human wizards get influenced by the wind that they are constantly drawing upon, as you can see by all the miniatures, which are all almost walking, talking stereotypes. Can I say more about the Shadow College? So yeah, the Shadow College. Interestingly, the newest edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay dropped it in by the University of Altdorf in, well, the Empire, obviously the capital of the Empire, which was never the case before, and I imagine probably won't be the case again when they do another version, because the Shadow College, the Grey College of Magic, was always in the east end of the city, down amongst all the tall rookeries and slums, the darkest, most horrible part of the city itself. And the Dodge Grey wizards themselves, they lived in a ramshackle building that from the outside didn't look that much more impressive than the horrible shanties and rookeries around about it in comparison. And that level of lack of, let's say, grandeur also influenced how many people saw the Greys, particularly because the Greys dealt with magic that, quite frankly, terrifies many of the other colleges in a way that is not immediately obvious, because they can manipulate your mind. And that's something that is just horrible to contemplate. They can actually play around with your mind. It's one of the reasons why you'll often find in some of the books they'll discuss the importance that the Grey College places on ensuring that they get apprentices that are, let's sum it up with just say trustworthy. Because the magics that they're going to be given require them to be almost brilliant, because they can really do some nasty stuff with their magic and take control of things. It's a shadowy magic, and it's a bit grim. The college itself is just It's a variety of ancient halls, libraries. You've got to remember that the Old Grey College is more related to Verena than many realise. The sword of justice represented on both sides. So that's the downward pointing sword that symbolises the college itself. And over with the cult of Verena, the very same symbol of the sword of justice. And that sword of justice is carried by the Grey Wizards. They all carry a sword as well as their staff. And that sword represents them making a judgment call as to whether what is currently happening is acceptable or not. Of all the colleges, they make some of the best witch hunters, for example, although they don't necessarily get a great deal of discussion about that. One of the interesting points with the Grey College is that there's not a lot of Grey Wizards there in comparison to a lot of the other colleges, because most of the Grey Wizards attempt to avoid the politics that come hand in hand with being in the city, because they're aware of how dangerous that power can be. And power to a Grey Wizard is a tempting thing. Think of good old Gandalf and that ring. There's a reason that these stereotypes have been pursued by various writers. It's because they like them. And it is represented in the Grey College to its very core. They're generally perceived to be wise. They're generally perceived to be very good diplomats. They're well-spoken, but at the same time, they're shifty, untrustworthy. You don't want them around because they could be doing things to manipulate things, and they are the ultimate spy masters. And that's another point to mark about the college. It is a centre for politics in general, regardless of how much the old wizards like to avoid it. All the younger wizards are neck deep in the stuff. It's got a fair number of apprentices in it, unlike some of the other colleges which have lots. We're looking at, say, the Light College or the Bright College, the Celestial one to a degree. Most of the Grey Wizards don't use the collegiate system, as in, yes, you're sent to college and you're taught in college by a bunch of people and you come out. They use the very strong master apprentice system, because they need to have hands-on control of their apprentices at all time. So you tend to find that most of the wizards that are in the Grey College are ones that have been dropped off by wizards of other orders because they found somebody who's very powerful in the Grey Wind and needs to be trained, for example, or they are the apprentices of wizards who have died and they need to be trained by somebody else, or they're just local orphans from Altdorf, of which there's freaking tons of them, particularly over in the East End, who are showing magical aptitude, so they get picked up by the college. So they're the vagrants and the strays of the Grey College, and some of those will become, in time, some of the most important members in turn. But I won't carry on too long on that one. Grey College, interesting place. I could end up being here for ages. Let's move on. Personally, still doing well, and Age of Simmer, don't need to worry about Age of Simmer. Let's go back down. You did play the starter set. Yeah, you should play the starter set. It's great, and that's not just because I produced the thing, and I think it's awesome. Hello, yeah. Steam tanks from the Empire. Steam tank, you can't go wrong with a good old steam tank. Here we go. Have the worlds ever be corrupted? Can they be corrupted by the Chaos Gods? That's definitely for a completely different stream. I think that's maybe something we should discuss with Sotek and one of the Lorebeard ones, because I think that would be really interesting as a general. I wonder what Kislev will look like. We've already had a pretty good idea. That was one of the first things that they dropped almost 2 years ago to give you an idea of what Kislev would look like when they worked with Creative Arts for Total War, and they built an entirely new Kislev, which was half based on the book that I wrote with people like Graham McNeil and Steve D was on that one as well. Who else was on that one? I think it was David Chart. Can't recall. And we built one version of Kislev for the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Lots of that got picked up. Other parts got picked up as well. And they added some cool new extra stuff as well. But a lot of the cool new extra bits they added were developments, as in new bits added on because they came later. Meaning I'll be very interested to see what version of Kislev they use. As in, if they go 200 years back, Kislev will be 200 years older. It's only about 800 years old at that point as a realm in the old world. And it won't have the same religious schisms. The cult of Ursun will be more dominant or less, depending upon which version you use. I'll be super interested to see where that one goes. Probably, yes, it will probably have bears. What unions do you expect for the old world free strategy? This is a little bit like saying how long is a piece of string. There are so many different potentials. If I was in control of it, I would probably go relatively wild. But you've got to remember that I don't have the restrictions that they have. And this restriction that I'm about to mention might not be the one you expect. I'm not saying a restriction in terms of they can't go wild because it goes against things in the past or whatever. No, none of that. It's purely down to the number of models that they can actually make and get into the shops, not overcrowd the shops, and ensure that each individual sculpt sells enough to justify itself. to get out there. War Master, for example, was famously stymied by this. It had about 10 codes per army. And by that, I mean 10 blister packs per army. And that was it. And that meant that some of the armies, which from the Warhammer side were known for having maybe about 20 different units, all of which had loads of bags of character and you wanted to see in the War Master scale, they got siphoned down to just 10 because they could only present 10 for each one because the armies in general in War Master weren't selling as well as, for example, the Warhammer armies, for all they had high hopes. So because of that, you only got 10 codes per one. And somewhat similarly, any army that we see in Warhammer, Old World, you're going to have expectations for what those armies should already include. And once you get past the first 5 to 10, there's very little space on top of that to add the new and the exciting. So you'll probably find the new and the exciting might turn with a specialist unit or one giant kit, which just makes everybody go, holy shit, they've redesigned that character completely. How cool is the new aerial, for example? Not that I would like a really good aerial at all. I really would. I remember the art from the first time that they built that character. It was done by Mark Gibbons. If you're out there, Mark, hi. That gorgeous piece of art. He did Orion as well. For those of you who don't know, I work with Mark Gibbons pretty much daily. Indeed, all day I've been writing stuff for him. And that's why I'm streaming right now, because I've had quite the day. Anyway, moving on swiftly. There'll be lots of new ones, I'm sure. Quote says, all those magic are like children. Also, Andy, Gur can go fuck yourself. Yeah, totally can. But I just meant from my perspective, I wouldn't like to have Gur running through that horrible, cold, wild wind. I mean, I'd end up becoming an isolationist, and I'm already isolationist enough living here on my dark corner of Scotland. You would be the sexy truth slayer model. Oh, yeah, I certainly would. Oh, yeah. Let's just move on that one. The Grey Wizard in Grey Seer was terrifying. Yes, it was, and quite rightly so. I do love my Grey Wizards. We had one in one of our streams relatively recently, having a little bit of fun. And the Grey Wizard in that one was one of the older one in the colleges. I remember talking with Fat Shark some time ago about how they were using Christoph Engel, which is the Grey Wizard that they were using, who in turn had been first introduced back in the role-playing game. And we reintroduced him again in the 4th edition of the game in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Starter Set. And there was no way I was going to have some Ubersreich episodes for my game that I was streaming online for Lawhammer and not include Christoph Engels, because I freaking love him. I actually did a quick picture of him as well, which you'll see on the one. It's over on YouTube. Go check my YouTube past videos, and you'll see one of them's got a Grey Wizard on it. That was super fun to put together. Are there any stories of witch hunters using Grey Wizards as counter-insurgents in the Chaos Cults? So stories, nah. What you tend to find is these are the sort of things that tend to get drilled into with the role-playing game more than it would do per se with, say, for example, the battle game, where it tends to be all top level and they only care about their named characters. They don't go down into the ranks and discuss individual wizards or individual sergeants or captains or whatever. You tend to find you need the novels and the role-play game before you go into that. And the answer to that general question is yes, that sort of thing would happen. But more broadly, often because they deal with deep stereotypes, the witch hunters are presented as so bleakly Sigmar-loving, hate all magic that they never countenance it until you actually met individuals and people who are working hand in hand with wizards on a daily basis. And of course, they would. The world is filled with shades of grey for all. The battle game in particular, and possibly the old world game when it comes out, does tend to paint it in terms of black and white. Moving on, how often do you spend writing for Warhammer anything at all? Do you write daily, weekly, etc.? I don't write for Warhammer anymore, except for my own games, and I don't spend that much time writing for it at all. As my players, if any of them are watching, will almost certainly tell you, because they're constantly bugging me for rules. I spend most of my time writing for what at the moment is our own stuff for Rookery Publications. We've been building board games and role-playing games over that. But you could use those in Warhammer if you wanted, because the whole point of our games is that they're system agnostic, which means you can use them for anyone. So you could argue that all of my writing of late has been for Warhammer, but it's also been for every other fantasy roleplay game as well. Do I write daily, weekly? When I'm well, I'm writing daily, every single day. I haven't been well for around about 2 months, and it's been the frickin' worst. We don't really want to discuss how bad it was, but I couldn't sit in this chair when I was ill. It was really bad. Do you have any tips on writing fantasy? Different stream. The answer is yes. In fact, I'll give you some good tips. The Rookery, as in Rookery Publications, has got a separate set of streams called Inside the Rookery. Inside the Rookery is all about taking a deep dive into the processes behind building the games we all know and love. Now, that includes things like, say, Warhammer. And we've had some of the people who've created Warhammer or parts of Warhammer on our streams discussing their processes. Equally, that includes things like computer games. We had Andy on, actually, who wrote all of Warhammer Total War. Well, he was the lead writer on that, discussing the processes that he has. We have had a lot of writers on discussing their processes. Pop in there. For example, just last Saturday, we had Adrian Tchaikovsky on, a very famous fantasy author, explaining how to create non-human characters and keep them being alien and non-human without them just being, for example, as we often know for things like Star Trek, humans with pointy ears, or middle-class humans who have to be spiritual, or middle-class humans who have to be something else, making them proper alien, but also something that you can relate to as a human reader. So I would suggest my first tip would be pop over to Inside the Rookery, just type in Rookery Publications into YouTube, it'll pop up, and pop over there because it's the best. Well, is the East End of Altdorf based in the East End of London? Strongly. I mean, it's not, honest, but yeah, it really is. Altdorf is, as a city, is a combination of every writer that's ever written for it. And most of the writers that have written for it have been UK based and have got strong UK leanings as to what a capital city should be. And a lot of those come from two primary places, and that's Edinburgh up in Scotland, and then down in England, London. And a lot of both of those cities have sunk into Altdorf in a variety of different ways, while simultaneously the city itself is nothing like either of them in truth, in any way, shape, or form. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't influenced exactly how it's popped up. The original version of Altdorf was only around about 15,000 people in it, and the East End, as it was presented in that, was, spoiler alert, burnt down completely in one of the adventures. But it was always a slum area. It was always lower class. And that got compounded upon by later writers. Each one who was adding material would look at what came before and they'd go, oh, it's like the East End. Yeah, I'll use that as a starting point. And away they go and they add their own details. It has developed much beyond its somewhat humble beginnings, but there is most certainly an element of it to this day in the good old East End. Unrelated to one question regarding the gods, is it true that if enough people believe in a god, the god becomes real? Would the reverse happen if everyone did right? So the answer to that is sure, yes, if you want it to be. The official answer to that is sure, yes, if you want it to be. Warhammer has gone through various iterations of accepting that as the truth and also denying that as the truth. There will be some who say that all there is inside the aether or the warp or the other dimension that lies beyond reality, depending on which name you want to drop on, depending on which edition of the game you're looking at, is just chaos. There's nothing else there. Others will say that there are entire divine realms on the other side. Others will say that it's a constantly swirling maelstrom of different eddies and currents, and these work around emotions, and the emotions of the material world form what lies beyond. So if you have very powerful souls in the material realm believing a certain thing, that will come to pass. So Sigmar may not have been a god, but with the entirety of the empire worshipping him, first empire, Sigmar is the best, first emperor, pardon me, he becomes a god whether he wanted to or not. And indeed may be in no way related to the mortal that originally did create him, so to speak, as an individual. Or alternatively, it literally is that mortal raised up and they become something new. I can make counter arguments to this being the case and positive arguments for this being the case, depending upon my mood. Now, when we're writing it, the general line was always never confirm nor deny. Create individual circumstances, not overall umbrellas. And by that I mean, instead of saying all the gods are this, you instead say, this god says he's this, or that demon says it's that, or this individual believes this thing. Keep the beliefs in world, and then that allows for the individual players to turn it into whatever best suits or works for them. And it works really well for the world building as well, because that means you can add things that contradict what other people believe, and they believe it, and it's also working. And I think that that works really well for the Warhammer world, which has had such a deep well of different writers adding completely different, often contradictory versions of what the lore is, that if you always remember to dial back and not take the God view, you pretty much can't go wrong. And Rapwood says, I wonder what the religious units will look like for Kislev. Yep, since before the Orthodoxy. That's pretty much what I was suggesting earlier in the stream. I'll be super interested to see what that one is. Really hope we get Sarah Alexei to lead Kislev. Yeah, the joke with Valna Reaper is one of the highlights of the Battle of Kislev Gate. I did a map for the Battle of Kislev's Gate many moons ago for a book called Empire at War. That was super fun to put together because I got to draw a whole variety of characters on that one. Worth having a look at. It came from Black Library. I played cards on War Master, Blood Vessels, Bavaria. Yeah, they were. Good old Chaos Dwarfs. George, perhaps we'll see more of the old religious practices. We may. We'll see. I never can be certain. Do I? Oh, Finubar. We'll get a model in the world. He's the only rule of any faction never get one. If he doesn't get a model, I might just, camp outside Games Workshop and start a protest. Hell no. Where's my fucking Finubar? I've always loved Finubar as a character, and the first time that I saw him properly depicted for the online roleplay game with all his resplendent red and loved him, really good. Being right no overdragging the house. Hello, got here late. I'm sorry to say you got here now. We've almost done our conversation. Well, Hammer, absolutely check out the Rookery. Thank you so much for the answer. Yeah, do check out the Rookery. Strongly recommend you dive in on the Inside the Rookery videos. I will say, if you're just a Warhammer fan, there are some specific Warhammer videos that we've done on Inside the Rookery, including, for example, a developer chat with developers from all 4 editions of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, explaining basically how they built the game. And that was super fun, and also included me, because I did the 4th edition of the game. So yeah, good times. So Drops says, technically we never got many Council of 13 members yet. That's fair. Council of 13 have always up and down all over the place. Yeah, so JL says, Adrian Tchaikovsky's books about the spiders is high up on the bucket list. Yeah, he discusses that in the stream. Do go check. The discussions I've heard of him on the interview are fantastic. Yeah, brilliant. Empire seems based on, do you search? Yes. Loosely speaking, the Empire isn't based on it, it's influenced by it. That would be a better way of putting it, because based suggests that it uses that as a model and adds parts to it. That has long not been the case. Does it look like a whole bunch of awesome versions of Holy Roman Empire miniatures? Yeah, largely because it was based upon people who were building a rule set to use all the miniatures that they had to hand, and that included large chunks of Holy Roman Empire models, which they then used, adapted, and turned into the Empire of Warhammer. So it started in that area, but it has become something so much bigger and different. Using the real world as a model for Warhammer has become less and less relevant as more writing has developed the setting in entirely new directions. At the very heart of it, one core difference means that it's so fundamentally different that using the two and saying that they're similar is always unwise, and that's religion. The Empire is polytheistic. It has multiple gods, some of them more important than others, but multiple gods. There are hundreds of the freaking things, but there are 10-ish that are more important than all the rest. An entire pantheon. And that means that they view religion in a completely different way to how religion was viewed in the real world. And that, right down to the basics of society, changes everything. And when you add in all the world details it has, the constant threat that the Empire is under, the nature of how it expresses, suddenly it's nothing more than a casual reference at best, in that they look similar because, hey, they do. But beyond that, when it comes down to the basic society, completely different. Finubar, favorite elf? If you haven't seen the stream that I did with Lord Master of Sotek last Sunday, you should go watch that. We discussed Malekith in depth, and we also had a really good chat around Marathi and Aryan and the rest. Finubar's not my favorite elf. One of those might be, but I won't say which because that'd be really hard to choose on. You're right, Glenn. Yeah, it used to be. It no longer is. I mean, it really used to be, but it no longer is. You've got to remember that most of the writers knew and know very little about Germany, but they do know a lot about Warhammer, and they do know a lot about wherever it is that they happen to be from, which is often the things that they write into the setting. So you tend to find that I would argue that the Reichland is much more similar to England than it is to the Rhineland, for all its appearance, might betray that. Quick off-topic question. Currently, Ved 9.4, an enemy within for Aluminium Wife. I'm glad to hear that. Thanks to hear that, Jinx. Now you talk about Carl France, who's gone mad, or someone else. The right client. Yeah, there's for those of you who are watching our game, it's gonna blow everyone's mind when the whole Carl France story comes out. That much is certain. Yeah, it's a fun one. Any plans on a Total War co-op stream with Sotek? Oh, he'd eat me for breakfast. I have played the game so little. I played the first one a lot, but I'd never really played. I got bored of playing the battles, which was my fault rather than anything else. The second edition, I played it a bit, and the second game, a bit. A third, a bit. I've not played it enough, but yeah, I'd be totally up for it. I'm buying a new PC in about the next week or two. We've been costing it all up, and it's going to cost me not just an arm and a leg, but probably most of my body for everything that I want in it. The primary reason for that being is I've got a big map file called the master map. And the master map is my map of the Empire that takes in every edition of the game, every Black Library book, every White Dwarf article, everything I've ever read, and just dropped it on the map. And I used that as the source for all the maps that I created for second edition and also fourth edition. Unfortunately, now the actual file is too big to open. My PC just crashes on it every single time. It tries, it'll spend about half an hour trying to open it, but it no longer does. So new PC time, I want to open that. I need it for my own personal games. So yeah, that's coming. Rule of dropping in second ed and travel part. Not sure what you're referencing there. If you want to confirm that in a later comment. For the example, North Germany doesn't really have a comparison with Nordland. Yeah, so yeah, my Nordland is quite different to probably the printed one. They've released some newer books for the roleplay game, and my Nordland, I have it entirely mapped in meticulous detail, and mine does not match theirs anymore. I'm going to have a good look at their one and decide which parts I can easily port over and add in. They've got a much smaller, much less populated version of Nordland. It doesn't quite match my one. Mel Hodlol, I have no idea how to pronounce your name. I'm just making it up. Maybe an impossible question. How hard is it to add characters into the literature? Would a non-affiliated author submit a request, or is it closed doors? So the only way to really do that would be to work on a property that is currently licensing Games Workshop material, or alternatively, go work for Games Workshop. It's impossible. You'd have to be writing it yourself to add it in. Now, if you mean, say, for example, for my own personal game, I have a way of putting people's characters into my game if they want to do so, because I have a Patron for those folks out there who want to do. We've already got a couple of those in that's super fun, but that's just my personal game. That's not the official game, for goodness sake. The actual official game, the only way to do it would be to be writing for it. And that's pretty much it, unless they did a competition or something similar. It's probably closer to Rome religious-wise. No, yes, but no. See, this is a really good one, and thanks for bringing that one up, Ratwood19. A lot of people fall back in that and go, yeah, that makes sense, because that's what Rome had. But there's one fundamental difference between Rome and the Empire, and that's that the gods are real. Now, you might believe that Roman gods are real, and if you do, enough power to you. But that's not really what history would suggest. But the gods of Warhammer are 100% real. Now, what they are behind the scenes can be debated till kingdom come. But they manifest. They have blessed servants that do stuff. They empower people who are otherwise potentially disempowered. In the real world, if you're a bloke, it's very easy to bully other people around you. Laws are there to stop it. In the Warhammer world, there's another thing that potentially stops it, and that is divine intervention, which can happen at any time. It is a brutal, dirty world, but it's also a world that does not carry many of the isms that our world does. And by that, I mean things like sexism. Sexism is based upon something that in the Warhammer world doesn't quite ring true. And indeed, they've got many let's say, female-presenting divinities that empower female-presenting people all over the place in a fashion that means that the male dominance that you get in the many real-world cultures just doesn't come to pass in the same way. So it's really easy to try and look at history and use that as a model, but it is, I think, given the nature of the Warhammer world, almost a lazy way of trying to understand how it all works. Now, I'm not saying that many writers that have worked on the Warhammer world haven't done exactly that. They haven't just picked up another society, dropped it down and said, it's just that, let's go with it, And they've ended up with some odd, bizarre sexisms, for example, that have had to be eroded perhaps with later editions, particularly if you go all the way back to, say, 2nd edition Warhammer or 3rd edition Warhammer. Some of the choices for some of the background there is just not good. I'm not going to discuss that here because it's just not great. But to cut a long story short, yeah, it's a better model and it is closer. But I would also say that if you just use it as a model, it will begin to collapse very quickly when you think of the real world practical applications of actual people that are blessed by gods. It completely changes everything. Yep, I was right there. Great. Let's move down. Someone says Elithanar, Eltharion, Best Elves, maybe Teclis. Yeah, there's lots of potentials there. I wonder what they plan to do with Galmaraz between the Empire factions. Yeah, this will be interesting. I'll be very keen to see what they do with Galmaraz. I wrote a chunk of material on the Empire during this period. This is the Dark Ages for Warhammer Total War. I'm not Total War, pardon me, Old World. This is the proper Dark Ages, so it's not the time of 3 emperors, where you have yourself the Wolf Emperors centered around Middenheim. You've got yourself the Ottoman Emperors over in Taliban, and you have yourself the Electoral Emperors, largely centered around Nuln up to Altdorf, possibly down to Marienburg. And it's a different era. It's collapsed even further, but they might try to bring some form of cohesion to that because they're going to have to build their factions. They're not going to be able to say, here's your empire, here's 5,000 factions and how they all build. They might build it into 2 or 3 or 4 different factions and how they go. But one of them is probably going to need to have that hammer. And that hammer is, I mean, if you're going by historically where it's most likely to be, probably Nuln or around that area. The chances of it being in Altdorf, if you go by the established lore, is very low. The emperor who is there is a Halskrug by the established lore, but I'm pretty convinced they're going to change that. And Halskrugs were not known for carrying the hammers at that time. The hammer was presumably carried by whoever was claiming Nuln. And when Magnus comes to power eventually and starts off in Nuln and spreads out from there and eventually grabs the hammer, the story is weak. Now, I've written that section for 3 different books in 3 different ways. The Tome of Salvation, for example, explains the route that Magnus took as he rebuilt a massive army from the shattered fragments of the Empire and led that over to Kislev's gate, the gates of Kislev, pardon me. But yeah, I'll be super interested to see what they do as well. I imagine that they're going to do their own thing with it. And I think that, for me, makes it super interesting because then I have to go, well, my history of the world that I've used in my game said this, because that's what it was before. How can I incorporate that part and still make it all work together? Just to say, on the whole, rejoice for Eltharion lives. The number of times that character has changed his character. I mean, he's like a bloody yo-yo, that guy. Do I ever think Games Workshop will fully release a detailed world map of the Warhammer world? Yes, of course they will. It'll happen at some point. They've done world maps multiple times, and they have been more or less detailed at various points. They're often not a great fan of penning themselves in so that they can't do future developments in new areas. So you'll often find that they will very rarely confirm exactly how the globe will appear on the other side, purely because that allows them to go elsewhere if they want to at a later date. But at the same point, yeah, we're going to get ourselves some maps on that one. It's almost certainly going to arrive at some time or another. Donate to buy Andy a new PC fund. Yeah, if you want to pop over to my Patron for Lawhammer, just write Lawhammer Patron and throw some money in our direction. I will not say no, because my PC is going to cost thousands of quid. I'm actually crying. No other way of putting it. Actually crying. I don't have anything set up for taking tips or anything else anywhere else, so you can't do that anywhere else yet. I've been told that I should. If you think I should, tell me. It's the Shadow King. Well, let's just not get into that. I'm going to take a few more comments and then we'll probably sign off. Thanks very much for everyone turning up before I do pop off. Where do you find the best maps for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay? From my computer, because I've made them all. So I'm sorry to say, from my perspective, that's the best place because I have an entire map of the Empire, which is enormously detailed. If you want to know more about that, drop into my Discord and ask. There's already a few bits of that posted up there, and it's the map that I'm trying to get access to with my new PC. Why don't High Elves have God-specific units for Kurnos, Loek, Wood Elves? Well, they do. I mean, take a look at the Swordmasters. They're the Swordmasters of Hoeth. Hoeth is the god of wisdom. The Tower of Hoeth is that great tower that is dedicated to Hoeth, the god of wisdom. And yes, there might be someone sitting at the top of the Moonstaff of Lilith waving it around like mad. But ultimately, that is a group of warriors that are focused on one god. The Phoenix Guard are 100% tied to Azurin. And they, in many respects, are living embodiments of his will and doing what needs to be done. So I would say that they do have them. So, yeah. There we go. That was easy. Myrmidia is a good example. I'm not sure of what, but I love Myrmidia. I wrote a chunk of material for her. Do love it all over. So I'm now going to say I'm getting told off. That is my wife dropping and saying this isn't a 10-minute stream. Yeah, it totally isn't. I got too busy chatting. I'll take on a few more comments and then I'll run off before she shouts at me. Laugh my ass off. Better get off the stream. Yeah, I better get off the stream. Uh-oh, I'm in trouble. Worldanvil.com. Worldanvil.com does have a few bits and pieces. I've got some bits on World Anvil as well. If you check World Anvil Law Hammering, there's some pieces up there indeed. Richest faction in the lores, and who's got the most money? I'd like to take that one up at a later date, because what does rich mean? That'd be an interesting one. I'm really curious if Galmaraz will be wielded by Magnus at the final battle, as of course he doesn't come Emperor till afterwards. Yes, the official word behind the scenes back when I was doing it was that he very much had Galmaraz and went to battle with Azavar Kul wielding it. But they may change that, because, you know, that's what happens. I'll be super excited to see where that all goes. I am really disappointed with Morrison Crescent. You suck. You're ahead of me. Why don't I work for Games Workshop? That's a long, complicated question. I haven't worked for Games Workshop for a very, very long time, but I have worked for people who license their material. For example, I worked on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and I was the producer for that game. But I wasn't working directly for Games Workshop at that point. There's a long story there, and if we want to take that up in a stream one day, we can perhaps sit down with a nice cup of tea and maybe a pipe. Not that I smoke. We'll blow bubbles out of it. Right, so anything else to say? Have you or any other authors given any heed to the fact that they're mostly marked, mostly men who are subject to chaos, even though they're a very young civilization? Yes, I have. Others have done less so. I have opinions on that. Possibly something the Lore Master Sotek and I can discuss on a Lore Beard stream at some future date, because I think that would be an interesting one. Interesting fact about Fishman. Very recently, Graham Davis, who was a core person behind the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, put stats for them up onto his blog. For maps, I hope they actually give us better maps than non-Empire parts. I really hope so too. I'm actually doing a map of Nippon just now. Now, this is a 100% my game version of Nippon. It is not Games Workshop's version, because I need one, because one of the characters in my role-playing game is Nipponese. So we need to build a version of Nippon just for this game. Games Workshop are going to run all over that when they eventually make their own version, and mine won't just be contradictory. It'll be so massively different that there'll be almost nothing where they link. But I'm building a new version of that, which is super fun. And yeah, that's a very good point there from Servant. So take regard, this is of Avalon being Isha's guard, pretty much. Total War is pseudo legendary hero. You should do it. Yeah, that's not going to happen any hurry. Yes, I'm about to say goodbye. Indeed. In fact, why don't we stop there? Let's see if there's any more quests before we go. Let's do that one. What program did I use to create the map? It's all done in Photoshop, which is, as I've been informed by multiple people, a stupid thing to do, but it's in there now, and it's the only place I have it. So that's where I'm going to get it from. And on that, I will say thanks very much to everyone that dialed in. This was, I hope, a successful test. We have had both the Twitch and the YouTube comments piling in there with ease. Everything appears to have worked. Thanks for dropping by. If you do have any further questions about this, I'm going to be probably dropping up more old worldy bits, because I've decided I'm going to play the bloody game some as well to do so. Do feel free to drop into our Discord. The link for that, pardon me, is in the YouTube comments, not currently over on Twitch, because I'm such a Twitch noob. I have no idea how to do any of that fucking stuff over there. So do drop by YouTube instead, click in through that side. And might I just end with a big thank you to the Lore Master of Sotek, because the guy rocks, and he just popped in with a big, huge chunk of folks. Yay for the raid! You rock. I'll also say looking forward to seeing you, Lore Master, if you're still in the stream this Sunday, and everyone else to tune into Lore Master of the Sotek's channel, because I'll be joining him this Sunday to talk about Warhammer goodies. Also, this Friday, we have our Warhammer stream, where we are about to, well, go check out the advert for that. That's down in Discord. Other than that, see you all later. An absolute joy chatting to you all. until next time, goodbye all.